happy Monday and welcome back to my channel. This morning I'm just heading to my CAD class as usual, and we actually have a little bit of like a show and tell critique today, so I don't know if I'm actually going to be able to show you anything that interesting, but if anything does happen, I'll be sure to film it. Here's a super quick look at the presentation I made for my class, which shows everything that I'd made for my thesis collection up until this point. My mood boards, my CAD designs, and all of my hand-woven swatches. At this point in the semester, I still felt like I wasn't really sure where I was going with this whole project and was just kind of making things with my chosen color palette and then curating everything later on. So there are definitely a few pieces here that didn't end up making it into the final collection, but also some that I was actually really happy with at this point too. I just needed to figure out what to do next because I still had a lot of pieces to make. Hello, happy Tuesday. I just finished up with my internship and I'm walking home, and tonight I want to work on some stuff for my thesis project. I just got a package in the mail that I am so excited about, and it's this book that I ordered secondhand from eBay that is all about a technique that is completely new to me, and now that I've kind of like discovered it, I've gone down the rabbit hole and I've become absolutely obsessed, and I want to try this out for my thesis project. It's called woven shibori. So you might know that shibori is essentially like a tie-dye technique. The idea is that you're either like tying your fabric or clamping it or folding it in strategic ways so that when you put your fabric in a dye bath, only certain parts are actually going to be touched by dye. It's a practice that has a lot of techniques and a lot of tradition behind it, and is just generally really beautiful and something that I've been wanting to kind of like dip my toes into. So woven shibori is the idea of creating the resists using special yarns that you weave into your fabric while you're on the loom, which you can then yank to create like strategic gathers, and those little gathers will essentially create pockets that aren't going to touch the dye. So you weave your fabric, you throw in these special threads, you yank it all really tight and bunch the whole thing up, throw it in a dye bath, and it creates really, really cool results. So this book is all about that concept, and I think this will work really well for my thesis project. So pretty much today what I want to do is just like spin some yarn, mostly white probably, both like regular and art yarn. So I have like a little stash of things that I can weave and dye and shibori and have a whole lot of fun with. So yeah, let's do that. To make a super coiled art yarn, I first started by making a core spun yarn, which means spinning some wool fiber around another yarn. This made a really squishy single ply yarn that was super lumpy and bumpy and fun. I then took that single and I coiled it around another commercial yarn, which is just such a satisfying process. And here's how my finished yarn turned out. It's definitely got a lot of character. I also spun up a whole bunch of my go-to thick and thin single ply yarn using some wool and silk blended roving. The next day, I started my woven shibori adventures. For my first attempt, I wanted to do a fairly simple structure similar to one I found in the book, but I had to first adapt the pattern to work with the threading that was already on my loom. I then wound up a whole bunch of the yarn that I had spun the night before, and then I picked out a super strong and super slippery pink cotton yarn to work as my resist. Then I just started weaving. I'm using my Ashford 16 harness table loom for my whole thesis project, which is threaded with a white wool silk warp. Weaving on this loom is definitely very slow going, but I still found it really fun and really meditative. For this design, I alternated between a few picks of plain weave and a pick of my cotton yarn, which had long floats on both sides of the fabric. I also left big loops of the cotton yarn on the selvages, which would help me pull the yarn to create the resist later on. So definitely stick around to see how that turns out. Hello again, I just finished up in my classes for the day. It is now officially the start of my spring break, which normally I feel like I would try to have like some fun adventures and go out and about and enjoy this time off, but unfortunately, I just have so much to do for my thesis project. This is just gonna be like a week of work. So yeah, this video is just gonna probably end up being like a montage of all of those experiences, starting with tonight. I have a package in my apartment in the mail room with some supplies for like ice dyeing and working on that like woven shibori, and I think that's gonna be the first thing I'm up to. So yeah, let's head home and then start my week of thesis project chaos adventures. I got some goodies in the mail that I had ordered from Dharma Trading Company that I was gonna use for some ice dyeing experiments. This included some more acid dye powders, which I tried to match as closely as I could to my project's palette. I also got some fiber reactive dyes, which technically aren't meant for wool and silk, but I wanted to give them a try anyway. I also got some synthetic white sinew, which is a wax-coated polyester thread that is great for tie-dyeing. I also ordered some sheets of white wool felt, which I thought could be fun to experiment with. But first, I wanted to see how all of my new colors would turn out on this material, so I made some swatches. And I also made some swatches of some silk fabric. And then I tested out how each one of my new dye colors might look when ice dyed. So I soaked all of my swatches in citric acid, popped them into a mason jar, topped them off with ice, and then sprinkled some dye powder on top. I then left these jars alone to melt for a few hours. Ice dyeing is a really fun way to color fabrics because as the ice melts, it splits apart the colors that make up a dye powder. So the results are often really organic and unexpected, which just felt right for my thesis project. I also really liked the idea of surrendering some of the control from my project just because I was in this headspace of overthinking everything, and leaving some things up to chance was just like really good for me in this moment. While all that ice was melting, I had some fun playing around on my loom with some scrap yarns, and I actually came up with something that I was happy with. So I just spent the rest of the evening weaving away. Once all my ice was melted, I removed the samples and I steamed them. And then I hung them up to dry. I was so excited about how some of these turned out. The next day, I started working on my next sample. I had the idea of dyeing a piece of white wool and then cutting it up to use as the weft in my weaving. So I started by tying up the wool with my synthetic sinew. I kept this tie-dye pattern pretty simple and I made some big concentric rings on the wool felt. When the felt was all tied up, I soaked it in some citric acid and then I covered it with ice. And then I sprinkled on some dye powder. I used two colors that I'd tested the night before and that I figured might give me some interesting color splitting. Next to that, I also dyed some handspun yarn. While that ice was melting, I worked on another woven shibori sample, and this time I made up a design of my own using some colorful handspun yarns in the weft, just to see how it might turn out. I then cut my samples off of the loom just because I was so excited to dye them. But first, I sewed the edges of each sample so I could cut them apart. Then it was finally time to officially try out the woven shibori. I started by using those extra loops that I had left hanging on each side of the fabric to tie knots. Then I flipped over the fabric and cinched it as tight as I could and tied another really strong knot. Hopefully you can kind of see what I'm doing here. It was a bit challenging to film this just because it isn't the most photogenic process. I then repeated this process for my other sample. And then I prepared an ice dye situation for each one. For this sample, which is all white, I kept things really simple and I only dusted it with one red dye powder. For the second sample, the one with the stripes, I wanted to experiment a bit. So I first laid down some gray-pink dye from my stock solutions and diluted it. Then I laid down my sample, covered it with ice, and dusted it with some yellow dye. I had no idea how this was going to turn out, but I was hopeful that it would at least be interesting. And here's how all of my tie-dyed, ice-dyed experiments turned out. The wool turned out such a pretty color, and I love how the rings almost look like they're glowing. And then the woven shibori, I was speechless and so excited to include these in my collection. Like I mentioned, I had some ideas for this piece of felt, but first I wanted to scan it in just because I thought the design was really cool and maybe it could come in handy for a Photoshop piece. Then, even though it pained me to do so, I cut the felt into strips, leaving one side still fully attached. I decided to paint the warp using some of my purpley, pinky kind of dyes so it would blend into the felt. And then I started weaving with the felt as if it were yarn. And I used the attached side of the fabric to make sure that my strips were being woven in the right order and the right direction, to recreate the original piece of felt, but like woven. I thought this result was so much fun. I love how the circles are still visible, but kind of broken up at the same time. And I immediately thought of some ways that I can improve this design, so the next day I gave it another go with a new piece of felt. But this time I added some color to the felt before ice dyeing it, just to add some more interest to the rings. I then added a whole bunch of dyes to this sample, both acid dyes and fiber reactive dyes, because why not? And here's how that piece turned out, which I was so happy with. I knew for sure I wanted to make a digital version of this design, so I scanned it in and then I cut it up. And then I wove with it using the exact same simple structure. And then finally, as if there wasn't enough dyeing going on in this video already, it was also Easter that weekend, so Ryan and I dyed some eggs. Hello, I know it's been a minute since we last checked in, and it's actually nearing the end of my spring break now, so I figured we'd do like a big official check-in so I can show you everything that I've made so far. I know that this video has been pretty chaotic so far because I've just been like bouncing between tasks pretty much non-stop. Like I'll put something to melt, something to dye, something on my loom, something on my computer, and I've just been like rotating between those over and over and over again. So hopefully I made that experience make a little bit of sense in the edit, and hopefully it's been fun to watch me just like making things here at home. I'm currently living in just like absolute chaos. This is my little corner of the apartment, and this area, as well as our kitchen and our bathroom, have just been fully taken over by my stuff, and I feel so bad about that. Ryan has been such a trooper, but that's just pretty much what every single day of this spring break has been for me. Just like rotating between tasks in different parts of the house and trying to get as much done as I possibly can. So yeah, let me show you everything I've made so far. Okay, so first off, I still have on my loom a couple pieces just because I have such little warp left. I don't want to cut these off just yet and waste the little bit that I do have. So I have my first trial at making a felted piece, and then I have my more official completed one, which is probably going to end up being in my collection. And then let me move my fish out of the way. These are all the handspun yarns that I have left over and the fiber that I have left over, which I still do want to card and spin into some art yarns, so hopefully I'll have time for that. Then over here I have my corkboard, where I've just been hanging up everything as I've been working on it, just so I could stare at things throughout the day and think on what it is I'm actually doing. So I have my 3 woven pieces with just like normal kind of weaving handspun yarns. Then I have my 2 woven shibori pieces, which you saw me weave and dye. And then I have another piece of felt up here that I ice dyed, which I think I'm gonna end up cutting up and using like a weft, similar to this one. But I'm gonna figure out the weave structure for that. So then down here I have the scarf that I worked on a couple weeks ago, and then my digital designs, which are definitely still works in progress. I'm not like super in love with every single one, but I think it's coming along. So I have this one that's kind of like a log cabin pattern, textural, weave inspired one. I have a tie-dye texture, my little geometric, my tie-dye, which is from this fabric. Then I have my stripe and my tossed. So yeah, things are slowly coming together. I think as like a full-on collection, it's slowly starting to make sense, but I think I still need like 7 more pieces before I can call it done. So yeah, I have about a month left to work on all this, and there's still quite a bit to do. Anyway, so thank you so much for tagging along with me on this journey. If you want to stick around and see how my whole thesis collection turns out, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and hopefully I'll see you in my next video. Bye!